the translation. One should be satisfied with whatever he achieves by his previous destiny, for discontent can never bring happiness. A person who is not self-controlled will not be happy, even with possessing the three worlds. So this is the penultimate part of this part of the Leela. So Vamanadev has asked for these three steps, and Bali Maharaj, who's a very pious king, even though he's from an Asura family, he's very welcoming to Vamanadev, and so Vamana, who is described as a dwarf brahmachari, asks for 3 steps of land. So they go back and forth. Even Bali Maharaj, surely you want more than that. I'll give you an island. I'll give you more than that. But as we know, he's not just a boy or a dwarf. He's Trivikram. His steps are enormous, and so soon we will see how that happens, or what happens. But we all know what happens. So in this, just kind of focusing here on this particular text, that's part of the debate going back and forth. What would make one person happy? And time again. So in verse 21, I think it was as Rasanath Prabhu yesterday, it's stated again that unless one's desire, unless someone controls their senses, they can't really enjoy. So in this particular verse, there's a bit of a hypothesis, an idea that our desires are endless, and that we will not have true happiness unless one can control those desires. So now, I did want to just kind of, ponder the idea of what the desires and how to control them. And I'd like to also say that in kind of reviewing some of my own discussions about Bhagavatam, I'll try to be more succinct. Plus, we probably only have 10 minutes left. Oh wait, no, 7:36. So, why are desires incessant, and how we could control something that's seeming so endless? And so in the Gita, Krishna says, "Apuryaman achala pratishtam samudram apa privashanti yadbhat." He says to Arjuna that the flow of desires is incessant, and they enter into the ocean like rivers. So there's the reality of the world is that, the reality of the world is that for the world to function, there are desires and there are action, there's karma, and for there to be karma, it starts with desire. So that's the nature of the world, and but apart from that, also, So another verse, Krishna says, nahi kinchit shanam api jato titashtya akarmakrit. He says, everyone is forced to act helplessly according to the qualities he is acquired from the modes of material nature. Therefore, no one can refrain from doing something, not even for a moment. So again, it reiterates this idea: if we're in the world, there must be action. We'll see Prabhupada somewhat addresses that in the last paragraph of this purport. I'll go back to that. But there is an idea, there is a generally idea when people study Vedanta that that the soul is contentless, that it's pure consciousness. That's what, a lot of times we say that's the general description, that's the Mayavad, Advaitin view, that there's no content to it. But from the Gaudiya perspective, or actually many Vedanta discussions, they're trying to determine whether there's agency in the Atman, which is debated. There's a lot of schools debate what the nature of consciousness is. And even within the Gaudiya text, they wonder what is the source of, does the Atman have in itself, like Bhakti, is that an element within the Atman? I think for us, we would say yes, that is the nature of the soul. It's the full expression of Atman, is to be devoted to Krishna. So anyway, getting back to this idea that desire is an incessant flow, and how do we, and here it's suggested that we should control our desires. Well, what is that process? And you think about, well, when I think about the history, well, I think about Buddhism. I do have some background in Buddhism. Maybe some people would suspect that because I'm Asian. My family, my father's side, they do come from a Buddhist, Taoist Buddhist heritage. And well, one of the founding principles of Buddhism are the Four Noble Truths. And for Buddha, for him, the first truth about the world is that there is dukkha, that we are suffering. And for him, that's the most essential thing that's clear. I think that some people may look at that as a pessimistic outlook, but that's just the reality. There is suffering in the world. And for him, in a more existential way, his second truth is that our suffering is actually caused by our desire, which he defines as Trishna, a thirst. So the more that we want in this world, the more it causes dukkha, suffering. And so for him, the third noble truth is that if you want to end suffering, then you should also end desire, stop desire. So in that context, that for us to find happiness, true happiness, means that we have to address desire and to control desire. In the Sankhya Karika, there's different primary texts for the Sat Darshan, for the 6 schools of philosophy. They all start with Atha, like Ato Brahma Jigyasa is the beginning of the Vedanta Sutra. But Sankhya Karika starts different. It says Atadri Vidha Dukha Atyanta Nivritir Atyanta Purushartaha. It says that the goal of man, the Purushartha of man, is the Nivritir of Dukkha, of Trividha Dukkha, the ending of suffering. Which is, it's it's interesting in the sense that yes, maybe for many people in their spiritual search, it does begin with suffering, in which we begin to find what are the truths of life. But I think that in Vedanta and in our tradition, the Gaudiya tradition, we tend to assert a more positive view, that we're searching for love, we're searching for happiness. It's not just because we're suffering or our goal of life is the cessation of pain. That would be an unfortunate. If that was our goal in life, I don't know if it'd be such a wonderful life. So for us, spiritual life in many ways starts with controlling the senses, and that's something that I think is worth discussing. And I don't want it to make it sound like it's dry, because I will, like I said, I want to make this more poignant to us. Rupa Goswami says, Vacho Vegam, Manaso Prodha Vegam, Jiva Vegam, Udra Pasta Vegam, Etan Vegam Yo, Vishaheta Dira, Sarvam Apimam, Prativim Shashishyat. That means that if a person can control their urge to speak, their mind's demands, anger, the urges of the tongue, the belly, and genitals, that person is qualified to be, to have shishyat, to have students, to be a teacher, to make disciples around the world. In Prabhupada's, anyway, an interesting thing in how we view that control of the senses. Prabhupada in the purport makes a very interesting comparison for some people that look at controlling the senses as prayashchitta, to atone for sins, and some people that do it as tapas. He compares it, it's a comparison of like treatment medicine versus preventative medicine. In one way, you could use controlling of the senses to stop the karma. But I think if a person is more has a better viewpoint of spiritual life, then to control the senses is just the baseline. It's like a more sustainable practice. We shouldn't use, controlling of the senses just as a treatment to stop karma or because we've done something, but rather to see it as the beginning of spiritual life, not just as something as like a way of atonement. So tapasya in some ways is a way to live spiritual life on a kind of standard basis. Now, I guess before I go on a little bit more, I know because controlling the senses is not the most exciting topic. I just want to say just a few more things about how if we don't control our desires, we go into the process of delusion. And that's again going back to Bhagavad Gita. And there's sections that describe the process of falling into the material world from 261, 262, and 263. One who restrains his senses, keeping them under full control, and fixes his consciousness upon me is known as a man of steady intelligence. While contemplating the objects of the senses, now this is the process, a person develops attachment for them, and from such attachment, lust develops, and from lust, anger arises. From anger, complete delusion arises, and from delusion, bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost, and when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material world. So that's just, I wanted to give a little background on the idea of desire and why it is so hard to control, and how essential it is for us if we're going to begin any type of spiritual life or spiritual practice, that there has to be some aspect of sense control. Now, so from here, I think this is where I will break off and maybe just share my reflections on some of the teachings of my guru and Prabhupada. One I think is that we've heard multiple times here, especially from my Guru Maharaj Ravindra Swarup, that following the principles are not just rules or vidhi. He describes them as principles of cognition. And actually, the other day he paired it in a discussion with the concept of recognition, which is something that I'd been thinking about some time. And that, in that sense, that I said maybe some time ago when I was giving another class, that if you love someone, sometimes you think to love someone means that you keep on project what you want. Sometimes you give gifts to people, and you think, well, that person's going to love me. But it's not really that. it's not really that you're giving gifts to them. It's almost like you're giving, or you're treating them with the image of how you want them to be. Like, and I said, I gave an example of a friend or a friend who was dating someone, and then he kept on giving gifts and gifts, and he gave so much, and then when the relationship ended, he was baffled. He's like, I don't know, I gave her everything. I I gave her this, I gave her that. I don't understand why it didn't work out. But it's not really that you give somebody that. Sometimes to love somebody means that you recognize them. It means recognition. It means you know them for who they are, not as you want them to be. And sometimes when you give all these things, you're kind of giving to that idea of them rather than seeing them for who they are. And I related that to Krishna, and how sometimes people see God as this being who's omnipotent and all powerful, but that's just a characteristic of God. When Krishna reveals himself as Krishna, like in this, say, it was Kartik, we're singing Damodar Astakam. This is Krishna showing him as he is. He's relating to us as he wants to be related to, not as like Aishwarya, Ishavasyam idam sarvam, this deity of omnipotence and powerful, which he is. But it means to recognize God. To love him means to recognize him. So my Guru Maharaj said that the other day. He said, we cannot truly recognize something unless we have unless our senses, or the senses in which we perceive, are able to see them correctly. And that's why we have to have these principles of cognition. And Prabhupada says very interestingly here, he says that when covering, he says that there are super senses. One has to perceive happiness by the super senses. The super senses are not the senses of the material elements. That means that there are spiritual senses in which we can perceive things. So in order to perceive things as they are, like if we think of the word, like to really perceive something means, one, you're going to clean your perception. That's going to require regulation. But also to see something does require love. So see something truly means love. To see something like philosophy, that means love of knowledge, to love knowledge, but it implies that you want to see something as it is. You have to have love, devotion. And I think I just want to convey that it is, yes, controlling the senses. But if you really want to love something, then you'll show that control because you want to see that truth. And that's interesting also that in Indian philosophy, the idea of philosophy is described as darshan, which means to see. And to see the truth, it's not about knowing it, it's really about seeing that. And I think that has a lot to do with that principle of recognition and loving someone for who they are, loving God for who he is, who he wants to be. And the last thing I would say about it before I end is that I think a major, as I kind of studied, my Guru Maharaj's kind of viewpoint of the world, he looks at our chanting, our Harinam, as the source of this, of being able to correct this vision. And not to see things just based on our lust or our desires, but to see things as they truly are. And he says that it really does begin with being able to chant the holy name, avoiding offenses, especially the offense of pramada, the offense of inattentiveness. Because all of our relationships could be corrected. I mean, if we can't pay attention to the time we speak or pray to God, how are we going to listen to anyone else? Our mothers or our fathers, our kids, our sisters or brothers, our friends. If we can't correct that offense of inattentiveness, who do we really listen to? at the core of, I think, my Guru Maharaj, because he spent so much time in terms of like reform and what had happened in ISKCON, some of the things that were difficulties for him, at the core of it was a kind of a kind of integrity of following these rules of purity for cognition, and well, really at the core of it, being able to chant Krishna's name without offense. And I'm just going to end now because about time. I'll end it with something Arjuna Prabhu had said the other day that was very that's kind of stuck with me. He said, as far as the holy name is concerned, he said it works. Whether you chant it or you don't, it works. Either you've chanted it, you're chanting it, or you will chant it. It works. And if we have faith in the holy name, if we pray to Krishna with attention, a lot of these issues of perception will start to clear. But we also have to do our job, our agency to control our senses. Those were just some thoughts I had. I had a few minutes, and I tried to give a little bit of thoughts on this. I open up if anybody has any other additions, Adi Prush, or anybody that would like to say anything.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Very nice class and profound subject matter. The principle that our own desires are the cause of our suffering. And the Buddhist concept of giving up desire, and the Vaishnava concept of not just giving up inappropriate desire, but to have purified desire, to desire properly. And the principle of following some rules and regulations is a good start. But like you said, it doesn't end there. Because actually, at one end of the spectrum is selfish desire, which is the cause of our suffering. And at the other end of the spectrum is love. So we are devotees. We're not surrendering to a list of rules. We're not surrendering to a building, an institution. We develop love and trust for a person. And every time you mention my spiritual master, my spiritual master, my spiritual, we hear the respect and the love and the value you have of his wisdom and his care for you. And that's the ultimate test, where we give up what I want and we say, how can I serve you, Lord? How can I serve you? So it's not just service, but we're serving a person. There's someone who's giving us it. We're inquiring, how can I serve you? We're rendering service. In other words, we're doing what they ask us to do. And that is our gateway. By the grace of the spiritual master, we get the grace of Krishna. The lotus feet of the spiritual master is the only way to obtain pure devotional service. Without that relationship, without that putting aside what I want, where I want to go, what I like to do, and saying, I want to please you. And that's what Krishna gets. That's the point Arjuna gets in the whole conversation. All this stuff about this kind of sacrifice and these modes and the demonic. Then all of a sudden, Arjuna says, hold it. I get it. Now, tell me what to do. There's the love. There's the surrender. There's the actual breaking point of our material desires. Let's see if anybody, I'm sure other people have something to contribute. I'm just sharing. I'm summing up what you said. You touched on a lot of really profound subject matter. Try to boil it down a little bit. All glories to Prabhupada.
All glories to Prabhupada. Thank you, Adi Prush. well, I am also thankful to you and other disciples of Prabhupada. You gave us that template. You show us how to be disciples. And it was Arjuna Prabhu's birthday the other day, and all he could talk about is Prabhupada. I could see that, especially as a lot of Prabhupada's disciples. You were in your 20s, and Prabhupada came here, and he was 70, and you are coming around that age, and you see like what this life has, what he's given you, and how you've lived your life because of his inspiration. And it's amazing to see that, and we are inspired by that. You've given us the template how to be disciples. Prabhupada really, he's the beginning. He's everything. He gave us, and it's like we were thinking about Vamanadev. Like everybody's like, how can I serve? But when you think of Prabhupada, he covered so much in his service. What could we do? What could we possibly do in 2 steps? His service, the effort that he's given. So thank you, Adi Purushji, and thank you, Arjuna Prabhu, and all the disciples of Prabhupada.
The tendency is to look for religion without surrender. Ram Raj without Ram. The spiritual world without God. No sacrifice, no obedience. Just I do what I like and I offer it to Krishna, which is a good start. Nothing wrong with that. But it's not where we're going. What Buddha says, I'm pointing at the moon. My disciples are looking at my finger. You ever hear that? I'm pointing at the moon. Oh,